Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Hiro Terrell and I'm the Program Stakeholder Engagement Lead at the SA Power Networks. Today's webinar is brought to you by SA Power Networks and Department for Energy and Mining. And we're going to be talking about the important changes coming into effect from 1st of July in SA, affecting solar inverter sales and installations and how they impact you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the multiple traditional owners of the lands that host the South Australian electricity grid. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that these are living cultures by paying respect to emerging leaders. Now, a bit of a housekeeping. Today's webinar is going to be an hour format, half an hour to 40 minutes presentation, followed by Q&A. And we're going to be using Zoom as our platform and session is being recorded. We'll be using Slido for Q&A instead of Zoom. So Slido is pretty easy to use. If you haven't used it before, you can just go to slido.com and put it in exports or scan the QR code. And so we ask you to enter any questions you may have along the way into the Slido. And we also encourage you to use upvote button so that we can answer all the questions that everyone's interested in getting answered first. There will also be a webinar feedback survey, which is going to pop up on the Zoom window once the webinar finishes. And we would really love to hear what everyone thought about the webinar so that we can keep on improving how we engage with you. So today's webinar is particularly aimed at the solar retailers and installers who may be operating in South Australia. And we're going to cover practical information on what actually means to you in relation to the upcoming regulatory changes in South Australia and our plan to roll out flexible exports and specific installation requirements from the 1st of July. And we're going to also cover what training is available now and what we plan to do. So we've got great speakers for this event. And to kick it off, we'll hear from Ian Furness, who will provide the SA government's regulatory changes, dynamic exports requirements overview. Then James Brown will speak about our plan to roll out the flexible exports. And then Ross Mullins is going to talk about the what these changes mean for you and step through all the process along the way. And as I mentioned, we'll have a time for Q&A using Slido. So just a reminder to use that Slido as we go. Now, we're going to start the first speaker. So Ian Furness is a Principal Engineer in South Australia's Office for the Technical Regulator within the Department for Energy and Mining. Please welcome Ian Furness.
Thanks, Hiro. So if you want to jump onto the next slide. So I'll give you a little bit of background here. The changes that we're talking about today, which put requirements in place for dynamic export capability, are the tail end of a group of changes that came in 2020, grouped together under the title Smarter Homes. The core of it is that from the 1st of July, new and replacement electricity generating plants, and by that we're typically meaning rooftop solar at the moment, must be able to have their export limits set and updated remotely. And so we call this dynamic export capability. We've defined these requirements within a couple of guidelines, which are available on our website, and you'll see the address below. We have remote updating methods, which is mostly a communications guideline, and that sets out how exactly the export limits are sent to site, what kind of telemetry comes back from site, and how all of that hangs together. On the flip side, we have export limiting methods, which defines a bit more about what needs to happen on site so that that export limit, once it's received, can be implemented by the plant. Next slide, please, Hiro. So why dynamic exports? So exports from what we call distributed energy resources or consumer energy resources have been steadily increasing as more and more solar goes in across the state. We have a power system, like all of the power systems in our country, which must operate with a very, very high level of reliability. And what that means is that because static export limits need to be supported by the network at all times, they're often set by the most challenging conditions. So the idea here is that export limits can be updated remotely, will allow owners of solar to continue to earn revenue from their excess generation, but also ensure that this is managed safely across the power system in South Australia. So the core idea here is that the freedom from having the export limit set, in a set and forget sort of arrangement, avoids it having to only account for the worst case scenario, which might only be a few hours a year. So this should allow for rooftop solar to play a larger part in the energy transition, while also ensuring the safe and reliable operation of the wider power system in the state. Next slide, please. So who do the new guidelines apply to? So these new requirements apply to all new solar and energy storage installations connected to the SA Power Network's distribution network, and also to plants where their inverter is being replaced outside of warranty. There are some exceptions. Sites which have a SCADA connection, and typically we'll be talking very large solar arrays here, 200 kVA plus. Sites which are currently configured to zero export are exempt from these requirements. There's very little point in them receiving an export limit. If a system has had its connection application lodged prior to the 1st of July, and installation is completed before the 1st of September this year, then that's also exempt from these requirements and does not need to be dynamic export capable. Likewise, we've provided some extra time for batteries to achieve this compliance, and so these requirements will apply to batteries from the 1st of March next year. Next slide, please. So this is a little excerpt from our guidelines, trying to break down how batteries and home solar interact when it comes to these requirements. The core idea here is if you're only installing a battery to existing solar, it doesn't need to comply until next year when that requirement comes into place. If you're installing both solar and a battery or a hybrid inverter, which can do solar, then it needs to comply from the 1st of July. So we've done a bit of work in trying to tease out all of the common scenarios that this can fit, and there are quite a few, as you can see. So hopefully that makes things quite clear as to whether a site needs to be dynamic export capable as defined in our guidelines. Next slide, please. So choosing the right system is really core here. So there are a couple of different places that you'll be able to find devices which have dynamic export capabilities and thus are, approved to be installed. So manufacturers of devices which have achieved full certification against the standard will appear on the Clean Energy Council list of approved inverters. So if you check that now, you'll see that some inverters have a software client option, and I think they've also got it broken out into a separate PDF to make it easy to find the devices. Under the most recent revision of our guidelines, we've also allowed for transitional certification. So these are devices where they haven't ticked all of the boxes for full certification against the standard, but what they have achieved is sufficient to achieve dynamic exports. So you'll find this list on a site hosted by SA Power Networks. And essentially the way it works is that these manufacturers need to achieve full compliance to allow for their devices to be installed from the 1st of April next year, but we're not requiring any changes to devices installed in the meantime. Now we should note here, in some cases, additional hardware is required, such as an energy meter, CT clamps, or both, or in some cases, a gateway device, and it does depend a bit on which inverter you're installing, so well worth doing this research beforehand. Next slide, please. So look, very finally, if you're interested in keeping up to date as things develop, I'm sure this isn't the end of the story for dynamic exports. Please feel free to drop us a line, and we'll add you to our distribution list so that you can be updated as we update the guidelines with time and as new requirements come into force. You can provide feedback and suggestions to us at that address as well. And likewise, our website, energymining.sa.gov.au/smarterhomes, is a good central place for all of the different regulatory reforms that relate to distributed energy resources or consumer energy resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Ian. That was really nice and informative. Now we're going to move on to the second speaker. So James Brown, who's the strategy lead for distributed energy resources integration from SA Power Networks. Please welcome James Brown.
Thank you, Hiroi. And I'll be providing a high-level overview of the changes SA Power Networks rollout, and then Ross, sitting next to me, will then dive into a bit more detail on what that means for the end-to-end process. So first of all, I just wanted to put a summary on the page of what's changing from the 1st of July from both the dynamic exports and flexible exports perspective as it relates to the actual changes from the SA Power Networks process. So as it relates to the dynamic exports requirements, as Ian has already talked to, any installation in South Australia which is approved from the 1st of July 2023 will need to be dynamic exports capable unless the site or the system is permanently configured for zero export. So what does this actually mean in practice? So any installation must only include inverters that have classified as dynamic exports capable per the CC approved list of inverters that Ian's already mentioned, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. And the site must have site level monitoring capability, usually achieved through an inverter meter or a CT clamp on site. Our smart apply system will be filtering from any non-compatible inverters from the 1st of July 2023, except for sites where there are zero export option has been selected. At the same time, our flexible exports rollout will begin. And so flexible exports as a customer offer will be rolled out suburb by suburb across South Australia. It won't be available everywhere all at once. And customers who have systems that are dynamic exports capable or are compliant with these regulations will have all the capability to be able to enroll in this new offer. And to participate, the system must be internet connected. It must be registered with us and capability tested with our systems. But Ross will talk more about what that means from a practical perspective a bit later on. Just go to the next slide. Can I skip that? So if we look at where we've been and what the next steps are. So as many of you will be aware, we've been running a flexible exports trial from September 2021, which has been available in limited suburbs. And no doubt some of you have either seen that or been involved directly by installing flexible export systems during the intervening time. And so we're coming up to the 1st of July 2023 when these new SA government dynamic export regulations apply, and at the same time our flexible exports offer rollout will commence. And that will be rolled out suburb by suburb over a 12-month period with the aim to have flexible exports available for all customers statewide from the 1st of July 2024. The rollout is going to occur across 4 phases, beginning with an expansion to the areas that have been offered already within the trial. So far you'll know that there are some zone substation areas that are were able to participate in the trial for flexible exports. And so we'll be expanding those to full suburbs from the 1st of July. So that includes 7 suburbs from Mitcham, 7 suburbs from Onkaparinga, 5 from Holdfast Bay, 12 from Marion, and 6 from Port Adelaide Enfield. Later on in phase 1, we will also commence rolling out suburbs within the City of Mitcham and City of Onkaparinga. Once we get to the end of the first phase, the pace of which will be set by how well the introduction is going from both the SA Power Networks and industry perspective, we'll announce the next phase of suburbs that will be rolled out in phase 2 or the next quarter, and so on and so forth until it's available across the whole state. The suburbs are prioritised based on the level of solar congestion. As I mentioned, we're already starting with some areas around where the trial's already been offered. And also we're looking for some geographical spread from phase 2 and beyond, so we can cover both metro and rural areas of the state. So what connection options are available in each of these areas? So within the flexible exports eligible suburbs, all exporting systems must be compatible with the dynamic exports regulations, so they must be dynamic exports capable unless they're configured for zero export. And customers in these eligible suburbs will have a choice between a fixed 1.5 kilowatt per phase export limit or a flexible export limit that varies from 1.5 to 10 kilowatts per phase. Outside of the eligible suburbs, all the systems still must be dynamic exports capable unless they're permanently configured for zero export. But the 5 kilowatt per phase export limit still applies for these customers. But they are able to opt into flexible exports once it is available within their area later down the track. So finally from me, inverter manufacturers have been working very hard on getting their systems ready to support the flexible exports capability and to be compliant with the new regulations. And as you can see on the left-hand side, there are a large number of brands that are already compatible through native and gateway solutions through the certification program. And that covers about 83% by OEM market share. On the right-hand side, there's a number of manufacturers that are still working on their solutions, many of which who have booked in witnessing sessions already in June to get their systems tested, and we expect others to book their witnessing in for later in June as well. And so we expect to see many more of those native systems come online in the lead up to the go live on the 1st of July. The best way to stay up to date on this is to consult the Clean Energy Council website, as Ian mentioned already. So there is a separate PDF list that you can download, or you can look at the existing list for the software client, as Ian mentioned. Noting that some of the manufacturers who have passed certification that are shown on this slide are still finalising their paperwork for listing, so they may not appear on the website just yet, but they have passed through our testing process. We have updated our website now to link to the CEC website, but we will soon start to include inverters that are on these transitional arrangements that Ian has already mentioned. And so you should expect to see some manufacturers appearing on our list in the short term as well. So that is all from me. Back to you. Thank you, Hiraway.
Thank you so much for that, James. And I can see a lot of questions coming through. I'd like to remind to everyone to please use the Slido for Q&A and use upvote button to identify the questions that you're burning to get the answers from us. Now we have Ross Mullins, who's the Energy Service Analyst from NU Energy Services. Please welcome Ross Mullins.
Thanks, Hiraway. So I'm going to talk about the changes to the end-to-end process and what you can expect when getting your approval, commissioning equipment on site, and then closing out the job in Smart Install. So initially, I'll show you just an overview of the process, and then as the presentation proceeds, I'll sort of break it down in a little bit more detail. So this first slide is just to show you the changes in the full process, just a bit of an overview. So if we start with pre-sale, we now have the eligibility checker that you can use to determine if flexible exports is available in the customer's area. You can email or print this information and attach it to your sales packs. So it's very useful when having conversations with customers, and you can utilize that to help the conversations. The application stage, as you already are doing, application needs to be done through Smart Apply. As James and Ian have both mentioned, only dynamic exports capable equipment is going to be available on Smart Apply, unless obviously zero exports is selected. In the installation stage, at every site, an inverter and an import-export monitoring device must be installed as per your OEM documents, and all exporting solar inverters must be under the site-wide exports control. Finally, the last stage, which is the commissioning stage. At every site, obviously closeout needs to be done in Smart Install. For flexible export sites only, it must be commissioned as per the OEM guides. The system needs to be registered, and then the capability test needs to be completed. So that's just an overview, and I'll step through sort of each stage now. So starting off with our eligibility checker. Now the eligibility checker has been on our website for a little while, so some of you may be familiar with its basic features, but we have new enhancements basically going in for July 1st So basically, the eligibility checker is a tool on our website that can be used to determine what export options are available for your customer. So it's as simple as popping in the customer's address or NMI and searching, as you can see there on the screen. And basically you'll be presented with information on what options are available for your customer. So in an eligible area, you'll see flexible exports, where you can opt in for flexible exports with a limit of 1.5 to 10 kilowatts per phase, or they can choose the fixed exports, which would be a 1.5 kilowatts per phase. Outside an eligible area, obviously the standard fixed export of 5 kilowatts will remain. Now, what that's actually going to look like, sorry, thank you. So for customers within an eligible area, as you can see sort of clearly on the top, the flexible exports is available at this address. What we have now is a chart below which actually shows past flexible exports performance in the customer's area. So this is just to help the customer understand what a flexible export system may look like. And it's just a good conversation starter that you can use with the customer. So this is what past experiences have been with the flexible export system. Alternatively, if the customer is not in an eligible area, you'll see the message there. Obviously, flexible exports is not available at this address, which means that the customer is eligible for the standard 5 kilowatts per phase. What we do have here is an opt-in for customers who are keen to get on the flexible exports offering, and basically they can opt in here so that we notify them as soon as their area is in an eligible area. So it is important to have the conversations with the customers up front, so that they're aware that all new equipment is going to be dynamic capable, and if they wish to swap from a standard to a flexible export down the track, it should be a straightforward enough process. So moving on, as both James and Ian have mentioned already, every approved system from 1st of July 2023 must be dynamic exports capable. This includes fixed export limit sites, either 1.5 or 5 kilowatts, and also the flexible export sites. So again, sites configured for 0 exports are exempt from this requirement. So in the pre-sale period, it's obviously vital that you ensure you're selling the correct system, including a certified inverter, an export monitoring device, a gateway device if it's required. So as mentioned, that will depend on what equipment you've selected, and then an internet connection for flexible export sites. And again, this is what our compatible equipment page is going to look like. So the Clean Energy Council is going to store the compatible equipment, but you will also be able to get there through our compatible equipment page on the SA Power Networks website as well. So now changes to Smart Apply. So as, or I hope many of you are aware of what Smart Apply looks like, so this is nothing new, but essentially I'm highlighting a few of the changes that are going in as of July 1. Now, the first point there is export options displayed at the start of the application. This is obviously an existing feature, but just highlighting that you're going to see a lot more of these flexible export sites in Smart Apply, and this is what it looks like. So essentially, you get the same information as you would with the eligibility checker. And for this site, you can see that you're being offered either the flexible export limit or the fixed export limit. So again, the main change in Smart Apply is that the inverter filtering for dynamic export capable inverters will occur from the 1st of July, unless a 0 export option is selected. So on the proposed page, which I'll show you on the next slide, you can choose from either a fixed, flexible or 0 export plan, and then the application will vary depending on what export plan is selected. So if we're looking at a Smart Apply application here, as you can see highlighted on the top, this is where you choose your export plan. Again, obviously you can choose fixed, flexible or a 0 export limit. In this case, we've chosen the flexible export plan, and you can see the limit there of 1.5 to 10 kilowatts per phase. The inverter list is, again, filtered by only compatible equipment, So you'll only be able to select equipment that is dynamic capable from that list. An important thing to note for flexible export sites is that the relevant agent will default to SA Power Networks. You can change this if you wish to. And another important thing is for fixed sites, a relevant agent is still required. So just important to keep that in mind. Moving on, the flexible connection is another new thing that you'll find on the Smart Apply application. Now, this is required for both flexible and fixed sites. And again, it depends on the equipment to what that's going to look like. So with some inverters, the flexible connection is going to be built into the inverter. With some inverters, it's going to be a gateway external device. So it is important that, again, you look into the OEM training and guidelines and get a good understanding of what your system requires. Finally, an export limiting device is required for both flexible and fixed sites as well. Moving on. I will just mention again, obviously I'm going through a lot of information here with the changes and things like that. So any questions that come up or any thoughts, please pop them into Slido and we can address them at the end. So this page here is just to give you a bit of an indication of what a flexible export site might look like. Again, it is vitally important that you are familiar with the equipment that you are using and you look at the manufacturer training and guides, so you know that you've got all of the important components that's necessary for your system. So again, just to reiterate, we're going to need a dynamic exports capable inverter, an export monitoring device, a gateway device, again, if it's required, it may not be depending on the system, and an internet connection is obviously mandatory for a flexible exports site. Now, just the note there, not required for fixed export sites. That's obviously to do with the export plan. It still may be required to have internet for your relevant agent with a fixed site though. So that's something else to keep in mind. Device registration. So this step is only required for sites enrolled in flexible exports. So once installed, follow the inverter manufacturer's guide. These guides will be hosted on the CEC website as well, so you'll be able to get all the guides from the one spot. So use these guides to set up, connect, and register the device on site. The registration is usually completed within the manufacturer's commissioning application. Again, these may vary, so it is important to discuss this with the manufacturer. Register the customer's NMI and device with SA Power Networks to receive the flexible exports limits. Now, the two important things to note, which are at the bottom of this slide, is if we receive notification that a flexible installation has occurred and the device has not been registered, the application will be flagged as non-compliant in Smart Apply. And the capability test cannot be completed until the system is registered. So that's a very important step there, which we'll touch on in the next couple of slides as well. So Smart Install Closeout. So once the system has been installed and registered if it's a flexible site, regardless of the export plan, the site needs to be closed out in Smart Install. The difference for flexible export sites is you must now complete a capability test. So the capability test is a short test to confirm if the site is configured correctly for flexible exports and that communications to site and the site level export limiting is correct. It is also a mandatory requirement of the SA government dynamic export regulations. So what the capability test is going to look like. You'll find the capability test in the last step on the Smart Install application. So once the system has been successfully registered on site, all of the equipment has been closed out on Smart Install, you will be able to commence the capability test. So you'll see highlighted on the bottom of the screen here, there'll be a button that just says Start Test. So with this example, the testing has begun and it's starting to go through each step of the test. So the test length is approximately 3 to 5 minutes and you'll get a verdict of whether it's passed or failed. A couple of key things to note on the application is the left-hand side, you'll see the tick box. That's basically informing us that we still have a few things to complete. So the capability test still needs completing, and the status on the top right-hand corner. Until that's commissioned, you know that there's still more to do on the commissioning side of things. So just to show you an example, a failed capability test is going to come through like this. A failed capability test will result in the application being non-compliant. So the application won't change to commissioned until the capability test is successful. A very important thing to note with this is the customer's export limits will be constrained to 1.5 kilowatts per phase until this capability test is successful. Obviously, the application will remain non-compliant until this test is completed. And again, looking at the application itself, you can see that the action to do is still there for the capability test. The capability test has not been ticked off yet on the left-hand side, and the status of the site is in installed, whereas we needed to go to commissioned. The capability test itself goes through a number of checks during the test. It establishes communications, and it applies and removes export limits to ensure the system is responding appropriately. So there will be an indication on Smart Install of where the test has failed, which you then can potentially use to troubleshoot as well. So again, manufacturers' training and guides are available to assist you with the commissioning and the registration of these systems. And if you do need further assistance, you can contact them as well. The capability test, as you can see here, for this example, it's indicated that it's failed on the first step. And so it gives you an idea that there might be an issue with the communications, for example. So moving on to what hopefully we'll see on all of the systems is a successful capability test. So pretty straightforward here. You can see that the capability test has gone to a green closed out status. You've got a test successful message underneath the test, and everything's been ticked off. You'll also have the site compliance reference number there at the bottom of the page. The final check is you'll see the status on the top right-hand corner has been changed to commissioned. And once this is all complete, you can leave site confident knowing that the flexible system has been set up correctly and that your customer will be getting the full benefits. So moving on to training, obviously we have been working with the CEC, and we have developed 2 training courses which are available through their Learning Hub. The first one is an SA Power Networks embedded generation compliance for South Australia, which will give you 30 core CPD points. We also have the SA Power Networks, what you need to know about flexible exports, which will also give you 30 core CPD points. A really important thing for the flexible exports course as well is that there will be links to OEM specific user guides and training materials, which will be very useful. Again, these are accessed through the CEC's Learning Hub. You can follow the steps on screen to find them, and obviously the enrollment key is SAPN training. There is a QR code on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, so we'll leave this screen up for a minute if you do want to scan that and get through to the Learning Hub. Finally, coming soon, we do have a Smart Energy Council face-to-face OEM specific training. We will communicate with the industry with the next steps on that one. So I'll just leave the screen for a moment if anybody wants to scan that QR code, and then we'll be moving into our Q&A session.
Thank you so much for that, Ross. It's great that you could step through the changes to the end-to-end process. That's really helpful. All right, so we've got lots of questions coming in, so let's get to this. So I've just got the joining instruction again, so please scan it in or type it in and then start putting in Q&A if you haven't started already. And just a reminder to use the button so that we can prioritize all the questions that's being answered. All right, so we're just going to go through from top. Now, Do you know if other states are considering this approach? James, perhaps you might be able to answer?
Yes, thanks. Hiraway. Yes, so Energy Queensland are also offering dynamic connections in Queensland. And we saw, I think it was just last week or the week before, Solar Victoria have announced that they are also putting in some regulations similar to what we've had in South Australia around requirements for dynamic exports capable systems, and the Victorian networks will also be rolling out flexible exports offers. In addition to that, we've been in discussion with the other networks from the other states across Australia, and they're signalling their intention to move in this direction over the next couple of years as well. So yes, something we're pioneering here in South Australia, and hopefully we'll see that propagate across the country over the next few years.
Right. Thank you so much for that. Now, we've got another question. All sites approved before July 1st. If SIC is before there is a cutoff date for the installation. Ian?
Yeah, that's fine. And I think this will answer the question under it too from Michael. So yes, under the most recent revision of our guidelines, if you have a connection application in before July 1st and the system itself goes in before September 1st, then it does not need to be dynamic export capable.
Thank you so much for that. Now, when calculating expected system yield to give a customer as an estimate of savings, how much should we expect export limits to impact on the system yield? James?
Sure. So as Ross mentioned in the presentation, we are on our eligibility checker page, you'll be able to see past performance information around export levels for that customer. So that's for the last 12 months of operation, or should that customer have signed up 12 months ago, what would their export levels have looked like over that period of time? So that will give you an indication of what the export levels would look like today, noting that they are subject to change over time depending on the uptake of solar in the area. But that should provide you some assistance in putting together your solar yield calculations and how this impacts what the customer will export on their payback, etc.
Thanks, James. Now, who's responsible for regulating and enforcing communications are maintained to inverters? And if comms are lost, will system revert back to fixed 1.5 export? Would it be Ian?
This one, Ross.
Yeah, I mean, we might both have to answer, I think. So our requirements are for capability on the system. They don't go into the actual sort of day-to-day management of the system. That sits with SA Power Networks. Under the guidelines, if comms are lost, systems do revert back to a fixed 1.5. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just adding to that, obviously, as Ian said, if comms are lost to a flexible export system, the fail-safe will go back to a 1.5 kilowatt export. Just on the regulating communications and things like that, we are also working on things for the future where customers might be able to see their system and get notified of comms failures and things like that. So we are working on a few things that will help in that space.
Thank you so much for that. Now, next question. Are dynamic exports able to be applied over diesel generators with the controls required to achieve this?
So from our perspective, the offer is for inverter connected devices and solar specifically in the first instance. So there's no plans to apply them to diesel generators at this point in time, although it might be something that we would consider in the future.
Yeah, I should probably mention that within the guidelines, there is an exemption for diesel, so there's no requirement, and that applies to small scale hydro and wind generators as well.
Thank you. Now, penalties will apply to households and sites that cannot control their exports.
Well, those sites who don't have installed the correct equipment will have to be on a zero export limit under the regulations. So I think perhaps that's what that question is getting to.
I should probably point out, if a site, let's say a site doesn't have internet, for example, would be a good case where they're not going to be able to achieve dynamic exports because there's no pathway for that site to receive the signal. Under our guidelines, they're still allowed to install it because it's a capability requirement. It's just that they wouldn't have a flexible export connection arrangement available to them. So they'd be stuck on a static export limit.
Thank you. What will be the difference between existing flexible export zones and new dynamic export installation?
Great question. So the existing flexible exports zones will be included in the flexible exports rollout. So just to be clear, when we say dynamic exports, that refers to the set of regulations, which means that installations have to be capable of doing flexible exports, and then separately, SA Power Networks will be rolling out the flexible exports connection offer like we've already done in trial, and those are the existing zones that you're talking about in this question. So from the 1st of July, those existing zones will still be have the flexible exports offer available to them, and they'll be expanded to the full suburbs within those zones. And then we'll be expanding the flexible exports offer to other suburbs in a progressive rollout thereafter, with Mitcham and Onkaparinga suburbs being in the first phase or over the first 3 months of rollout.
Thank you, James. A zero export site can apply to a new export limit if they change their inverter technology to a compliant inverter.
Yes, they can.
Yeah,
so as long as their system is capable, they can enroll in our offer.
Yep, I should probably point out here, if they change their inverter, that's one of the triggers for dynamic export requirements on the site too.
Thank you. The reason behind areas that dynamic exports are not allowed because the equipment of the surrounding sites are legacy tech, unable to do dynamic exports.
So I think this question is referring to why some areas are not flexible exports eligible from the 1st of July. So this is really because we wanted to enable a progressive rollout so that it minimises the additional impact to industry from the beginning, as these are new, quite complex requirements that are being introduced. So we want to make sure that everything goes smoothly in the early days. We're going to learn a lot during the first couple of months of operation. And so we wanted to have a gentle start and then we'll ramp up thereafter. But as we said during the presentation, within 12 months, flexible exports offer will be available statewide.
Thank you, James. If a fixed export plan is selected, is the smart install commissioning test still required?
Yeah, I can answer this one. So as I sort of went through in the presentation, on a fixed export plan, the equipment does need to be dynamic export capable. But if you've chosen a fixed export limit, basically you're not registering in the flexible exports offering, and then you don't have to do the capability test in Smart Install. However, the equipment itself still does need to be commissioned in Smart Install, but the capability test itself is only for flexible export sites.
Thank you. What about electric car vehicle to grid export, as they can be used outside solar export times?
So from the flexible exports perspective, vehicle to grid is considered storage export, so that is not required to participate in our flexible exports offer at this time, although we're looking to introduce offers that include electric vehicle charging and battery systems in the future. So that will be something we'll consider in the future.
Thank you. Do we know when flexible exports will be available for MEG applications?
So the flexible exports offer will be under trial for MEG applications from 1st of July, but they'll be selected on a case-by-case basis in situations where we've done a manual assessment and identified that there is an export constraint on that site as part of the connection process. So we'll start doing those assessments from the 1st of July, and we'll be notifying customers that there's a new option available for them as we, so we can test the flexible offer before we roll it out more broadly.
Thank you. What happens to a new install that's approved for 5 kVA export, and then later on, the suburbs become part of the flexible exports?
Yeah, I can answer that one. So basically, if the system's already installed and you've got a 5 kilowatt export plan and you're not changing anything, obviously these new changes won't affect the customer until they are making changes. If it's a thing that it's a new install and it's currently a fixed 5 kilowatt export, and like we spoke about in the presentation, they want to opt into flexible exports. And basically all the equipment will be dynamic capable, and once that area is in the flexible exports area, the export plan can be swapped over to a flexible exports. So it just depends on what situation you're in at that point.
Yeah, probably flag it's voluntary. You know, it's not like if they're signed up to a 5 kVA that they'll be automatically moved over to flexible or anything like that. They'd have to initiate it themselves.
Thank you. Well, SAPN will be bringing in DRED-like Energy Queensland.
So this is referring to the solar backstop scheme in Energy Queensland, which is using the DRED and the AFLC system. So no, we have no intention of bringing that in. We already have regulations for remote disconnection, and now we have flexible exports to assist with managing solar output during times of system security risk. Yeah, so we have no intention of bringing in the DRED-like system like in Energy Queensland.
Thank you. If a house needs major upgrades, for example, meter relocation mains updated and can't be installed prior to September 1st, will there be exceptions granted in those cases?
Yes, I guess that's one for me. Yeah, I mean, look, anyone can apply for an exemption. That's just a given. So I think we'd have to consider those on a case-by-case basis. It would very much depend on it. There's nothing within the guidelines that provides an automatic exemption for those cases.
Thanks, Ian. What happens if the customer's internet connection goes offline?
Yeah, this is something we've mentioned previously. If it is a flexible export site and the customer's internet goes offline, the system will fail-safe back to an export limit of 1.5 until that internet connection is restored, and then they'll be receiving the flexible limits again.
Thank you. What if an existing customer has multiple inverters and one fails? Do they have to upgrade the entire system to one inverter?
Yeah, so under our guidelines, if the failed inverter is replaced under warranty, then that is not a trigger. If it's outside of warranty and they replace the inverter, then that is a trigger, and that site would need to be dynamic export capable.
Thank you. The dynamic exports can be applied for FCAS and DR responses, and site with zero export allowed to export during and FCAS or DR call.
So typically sites that are responding to FCAS or demand response are battery systems, which are currently exempt from the requirements. So they can still have a 5 kilowatt fixed export limit, and so effectively they are exempt in the short term. We'll be working through how FCAS and demand response schemes fit in with flexible exports as we work towards the requirement for battery systems to be included in the scheme from March 2024.
Thank you. Also, this is similar question, so we'll skip that.
Yes, so the answer is no.
Yes. Is there hope that Queensland adopt the same flexible exports approach, or do we need a federal legislation standards to push DNSPs to conform to a national standard?
So we are using the same technical standard. So Common Smart Inverter Profile Australia, using the IEEE 2030.5 protocol for those interested in the detail. So we've been working very closely with Energy Queensland as we've been developing our flexible export solutions. We have clients or inverter systems that are operating both on our server and on or within our system and with Energy Queensland system without any issues. That being said, some kind of national standardization around testing and certification and cybersecurity requirements would be very useful, and we we understand that this is under consideration currently by the Energy Security Board into their review into DER interoperability. So we're hopeful that there'll be a good result coming out of that.
Thank you. Now, if up to 10 kilowatt of solar is being exported per site, will this not push export rates lower and lower by retailers?
It's a complex question. I mean, one of the things is that, you know, lower wholesale prices are something that retailers love, you know, and so when rooftop solar's pushing a lot of energy to the grid, it means the overall demand is lower, which means that you've typically got lower costs for large scale generation because there's less demand that they need to meet. So the cheaper ones tend to fill up the bid stack. Difficult to answer solidly. It might even, you know, be different from retailer to retailer, but in general, if the demand needed to be met from the grid from the large generators is lower, that means wholesale prices are lower, which retailers love.
I will have to put a plug in here for our market active solar project as well. So we have partnered with 2 retailers, Simply Energy and AGL, who, you know, from a later date will have retail offers that do consider flexible exports and retailer solar management within their schemes. And so they're looking at how that impacts their total package in terms of customer offers that fit around solar flexibility. You know, from our perspective, SA Power Networks don't have any control over the feed-in tariff, so that's kind of out of our wheelhouse. But be interesting to see how that collaborative trial plays out over the next 12 to 18 months.
Thank you. A zero export site can apply to a new export limit if they change their inverter technology to a compliant inverter.
Yeah, I think we had that question or similar before. Yeah, basically, if the technology is changed to a dynamic capable inverter, then and they're in a flexible exports area, then yes, they can opt in to the flexible exports trial offering. Sorry.
Thank you. And this is similar question. So let's start. Well, this is a comment about the shed installs are going to be expensive. We'll just note that. Who will reach out to existing homeowners in the current flexible export zone with a fixed 1.5 export to let them know that they are now eligible?
So we don't have any intention to do any proactive communications at this time, although it is something that we've considered and may consider again in the future. I think there's an opportunity for the solar retailers involved with those customers to let them know that they're now flexible compatible, so they can get a better outcome from their solar system. That would probably be the best path, and they may find out through marketing and other channels that we're pushing out through the program as well.
Thank you. If comms are lost, you mentioned that the solar system will revert back to 1.5 kilowatt export limit. How is this achieved?
Yeah, basically, so yeah, as mentioned, obviously you're correct in saying that if the comms are lost, the system has a fail-safe of going back to 1.5. And basically our internal systems are constantly communicating with the device and sending constant limits, whether that's the full amount or if it's being constrained. As soon as it recognises that the comms are offline, the fail-safe kicks in and it goes back to a 1.5 kilowatt export limit until the connection is re-established.
Thank you. Will there be exceptions for two-phase house in regards to either multiple inverters or more the 5 kilowatts on one phase?
Yeah, I think that's more than 5 kilowatts on one phase, what that reads. Yes, it's something that we are considering. We don't have a position on yet, but it's something that we will communicate once we do have a position on. We're thinking about how this works for customers on those two-phase connections.
Thanks. Why is the switch team listed on the drop-down for flexible connection, but also listed as only in progress on the compliance side?
Then there's a question further down about why is switch team listed as in progress for compliance? Wasn't this used for flexible export in the trial? So I'll maybe answer that part, which is, So there have been some minor technical changes between the requirements between trial and the dynamic exports requirements. We learned a lot through the trial, and there were some recommendations and changes made to the standard. So switched into going through the process of certifying their system for the new requirements right now. It's a very minor changes that they need to make, and we're very confident that they'll get across the line before the 1st of July. In terms of why we showed it, I think that was just a mock-up that we had produced for a demonstration. So yeah, that's those flexible connections in the example are purely just an example. That's not a final list or anything like that, and the list itself will be fed directly from the CEC as well.
Thank you. If commercial business owners don't want to pay for a MEG application, can we offer a zero export system?
No, not at this stage. So there aren't any changes to the MEG process at this time, although there are changes being considered for the end-to-end MEG process as part of the broader flexible exports rollout, but this is not something that is being considered at this time.
Thank you. Now, how does flexible export system work? Are export limits communicated over the internet from SAPN or Avon? Where can information be found regarding commissioning?
Sure, I can answer this question. So we host what we call a utility server, which sits on the internet. And when a flexible export system is commissioned, that inverter or gateway device is connected into our server. And so every certain period of time, we calculate new export limits, which are then downloaded by that inverter over that internet connection from the server. And that's all done based on standards-based communication using this IEEE 2030.5 protocol. So it comes from SA Power Networks, the export limits, and they're calculated based on the conditions of the local network at that point in time to maximize the capacity that we make available to customers. In system emergency conditions, so for example, back in November last year, where we were islanded from the Victorian power system in South Australia, and there were times of system security risk, sometimes AUMA does direct SA Power Networks to reduce the output from solar. And in those cases, we would put a manual intervention over those automatically calculated export limits during those periods to reduce the output of solar systems to keep the system stable. On the second part of the question, perhaps Ross, you can answer that.
Yeah, so the commissioning information, like I sort of spoke about in the presentation, they will all be available on the CEC, and they'll all be, all commissioning guides will be available in the one place as well. So you'll be able to hopefully find out all the information you need there, and then moving on from that, you can actually reach out to them directly as well for more information or to discuss any sort of further questions you might have.
Thank you so much for that. Conscious of the time, we are happy to perhaps hang around for 10 minutes or so just to go through the questions if some of you may wish to stay on. And we'll just cover as much as we can and then before finish it off. And also the reminder, so if you have all the questions that you would like us to answer, please make sure that you use the upvote button so that they will come up to the top of the list. All right, solar installations on sheds that have subboards a long way from main switchboards. How can this be made compliant for flexible exports, or is this exempt?
Yeah, we actually had a similar question, and they ended up using a remote RS485 sort of radio device to get the energy meter to talk to the shed board. I think one of the important things to point out here is that while this has been while it's been fairly straightforward to achieve export limitation by limiting the inverter capacity, if you've got a 5 kilowatt inverter, you don't need to worry about measuring the exports if you're on 5 kilowatt export limit. When that goes down to 1.5 kilowatts, it's a lot harder to achieve using that solution. So in a lot of cases now, there'll need to be some way of measuring the exports, or you're going to end up with a very small system, 1.5 kilowatts. So.
Thank you. And solar and generators cannot work together in island mode. Can dynamic export limit allow their joint operation for an X-gas row or demand via response?
So flexible export is really designed for systems that are grid connected. So it's about managing or regulating the site import and export, setting limits on that operation. If the system is islanded, there is no export limit to set. In theory, the technology stack that's being used in communications could potentially be used to do some other kind of coordination if one wanted to do so, but not the flexible exports capability specifically. It's not designed for that.
Thank you. Sites having 2 EGs, a string and a hybrid inverter with batteries, would this fall under combined site dynamic export limit? If yes, would it impact VPPs?
Yeah, so we're saying if we've got 2 generators on site, basically, yeah, it's a site-wide export limit. So at the moment, you know, there'd need to be controls in place to make sure it doesn't exceed the static limit. Under a dynamic export arrangement or a flexible export connection agreement, you know, there'd need to be controls that would ensure that the exports from those systems combined didn't breach the export limit for the site.
Thank you. I've seen previously that 98% of the time 10 kilowatt export is allowed. Does that time work off 24 hours or daylight hours?
Great question. So that is on daylight hours, although the 98% was active for the trial period. So as we shared during the presentation, there will be a chart of past performance information provided within the eligibility checker platform, and that will also give you the ability to see at what percentage of time exports in the past 12 months have been at 10 kilowatts or at the maximum inverter capacity of that customer. And so there'll be much more specific past performance information available from the go live of flexible exports out of the trial conditions.
Okay. This runs through the process of previous installation in flexible exports area, exceeding fixed exports set at DM 1.5.
To access, yep, I can help with that one. So essentially, if you previously signed up for a fixed export of 1.5 because your equipment wasn't compatible back maybe during the trial period, and now you're looking to swap over to flexible exports, basically, if the equipment is compatible, you just need to raise a new application through Smart Apply and update the exporting plan. And this will involve, like I showed in the presentation, adding your flexible connection, and the export monitoring device should already be on site. So it's basically just a matter of updating the export plan and adding the flexible connection through Smart Apply. And then, like I showed, registering the device and commissioning in Smart Install, followed by the capability test if you are swapping over to flexible exports. So the main thing as well is just to reach out to the manufacturer and make sure that the equipment that you have is compatible and might need a software update or something of the like, or if it is one that needs a gateway device, it's just important to have those discussions.
Thank you. So, are there flexible export limits that are calculated, published anywhere other than via the inverter protocol? For example, for showing in a reporting dashboard.
So at the go live of flexible exports, there won't be this availability, but we are planning to launch a new platform, which we call Smart Insights, which will allow a customer to log in and see the historic export levels out there that their inverter has received over extended periods of time and see that charted against their export output. So we hope that that will be available by the end of this year, but we'll provide more information on that in due course.
Thank you. Last question. What's the impact for customers using retailers such as Amber? Can Amber override the flexible exports if required?
So Amber can't override the flexible export limit because that's setting the safe export level of the network, so that can't be overridden. The impact for customers using Amber, I guess, just that their solar will be on the flexible export limit, but the customer will also be exposed to the wholesale market prices as they are on their Amber retail deal. So yeah, probably not too much more to say about that.
All right. Thank you so much for that. This is going to be the last question. So for sites with multiple enemies, which would currently be considered as a cluster, would flexible exports override the need for a MEG application?
Yes, the intention is that sites that are in SEG clusters from the 1st of July will not need to go through the MEG application process. They will have this option to sign up to a flexible exports connection instead. But we'll be providing more information on what that looks like in due course.
All right, thank you so much.
Go through. Perfect. Thanks everybody for your involvement in the Q&A. And then finally, just a slide to wrap up. Obviously, the SA government dynamic export requirements come into effect from the 1st of July 2023, which we've mentioned a few times, so I'm sure everyone is well aware of that by now. The SA Power Networks Flexible Exports Standard Connection option will commence rolling out from 1st of July 2023 across to 2024 as well. We do have information and training available on our website. As usual, we do have our New Energy Services team readily available to support and assist, whether it's with applications or commissioning or anything like that. So you feel free to send us an email at our email address there, or call us on our phone number at the bottom of the screen. A couple more QR codes there as well for flexible exports information. Feel free to reach out if you need any assistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Just to finish it off, so today's session is recorded and the link will be provided to everyone who's registered. So give us a day or two also to get that sorted out. Please feel free to share widely. We want to get the information out to the industry as wide as possible. Thanks again everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next SA Power Networks webinar.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.